Welcome to the Haunted Lore podcast, where history's darkest corners reveal their secrets. Today, we're traveling to the Southern Hemisphere, to a place where justice was harsh and death was a daily visitor. A place where the walls still echo with the final prayers of the condemned and the angry curses of the wrongfully imprisoned. Old Melbourne Gaol. For nearly a century, this imposing bluestone fortress housed Victoria's most dangerous criminals and witnessed the execution of 133 prisoners. But long after the last inmate was transferred and the gallows fell silent, something remains. Something that has never left cell 17. Unlike most hauntings where the identity of the restless spirit is known, the entity in cell 17 remains anonymous, a faceless rage trapped in stone and time. Join me as we unlock the door to Australia's most violently haunted prison cell, where visitors leave with more than just memories. They leave with physical marks from an unseen hand. To understand the darkness that permeates cell 17, we must first understand the prison that houses it. Built in stages between 1842 and 1864, Old Melbourne Gaol rose from the landscape as a monument to Victorian-era justice. Imposing, unforgiving, and deliberately intimidating. The three-story structure of dark bluestone was designed not just to contain criminals, but to strike fear into the hearts of any who might consider breaking the law. The prison's design followed the popular panopticon concept, allowing guards to observe prisoners without the inmates knowing whether they were being watched. This psychological element of constant surveillance was just one aspect of the prison's approach to rehabilitation through punishment and isolation. By the 1850s, Melbourne was experiencing a population explosion fueled by the Victorian gold rush. The city swelled with prospectors, merchants, and opportunists of all kinds. And with this rapid growth came an increase in crime. The jail quickly became overcrowded, housing men, women, and even children as young as 10 years old. Life inside these bluestone walls was harsh beyond modern comprehension. Prisoners were subjected to the separate system, a regime of near-total isolation intended to force contemplation of one's crimes. Many inmates spent 23 hours a day alone in their cells, with only 1 hour for exercise conducted in eerie silence. The cells themselves were barely 7 feet by 4 feet, smaller than many modern bathroom stalls. In winter, the bluestone walls trapped the cold. In summer, they held the heat. Ventilation was poor, sanitation worse, and disease was rampant. Prisoners slept on thin mats on the floor or, if they were fortunate, narrow wooden beds. Punishment for breaking the numerous prison rules was severe. Floggings were common. The punishment box was a coffin-like container where prisoners would stand for hours in complete darkness. Perhaps most feared was the silence mask. A leather hood that covered the head completely, with only small holes for breathing, plunging the wearer into sensory deprivation while simultaneously identifying them as an incorrigible troublemaker to other inmates and guards. For those deemed beyond rehabilitation, the jail had one final solution. Between 1842 and 1929, 133 prisoners met their end at the gallows. The first was an Aboriginal man named Tunnerminnerwait, executed for the murder of 2 whale hunters. The most famous was bushranger Ned Kelly, whose last words, "Such is life," have become embedded in Australian folklore. The execution process itself was a grotesque ritual. Condemned prisoners spent their final night in a special cell near the gallows. At dawn, they would be led to the execution chamber, where a hood was placed over their head and a noose around their neck. The trapdoor would open, and if the calculations of the hangman were correct, death would come swiftly from a broken neck. If not, the prisoner would slowly strangle as spectators watched. After execution, prison officials would create death masks, plaster casts of the deceased's face, ostensibly for phrenological study, but serving equally as grim souvenirs and warnings to others. These masks, with their hollow eyes and slack features, can still be seen in the jail today, silent witnesses to the prison's bloody history. Among the 60 cells that compose the remaining section of Old Melbourne Jail, Cell 17 is unremarkable in its appearance. Located on the second floor of the West Wing, it is identical to its neighbours, a narrow rectangle of bluestone with a high, barred window that admits minimal light, a heavy wooden door, and walls etched with the desperate graffiti of former occupants. What makes Cell 17 different is not what can be seen, but what can be felt. Visitors describe an immediate sense of heaviness upon entering, a pressure on the chest and a chill that seems to penetrate deeper than mere temperature. Tour guides report that even on busy days, Cell 17 often appears darker than surrounding cells, as though the light itself is reluctant to enter. Unlike many hauntings in historic prisons, the identity of the spirit that haunts Cell 17 remains unknown. Prison records for specific cell assignments were poorly kept or have been lost to time. This anonymity seems to intensify the haunting. There is no name to humanize the presence, no story to explain its rage, only the cold fact of its existence and its apparent hatred for the living. What we do know is that Cell 17 likely housed hundreds of different prisoners during the jail's operation. Any of them could be the source of the haunting. A convicted murderer bitter about his execution. A petty thief who died of disease while awaiting trial. Or perhaps someone entirely innocent, consumed by the injustice of their imprisonment. Some paranormal researchers speculate that the cell may have been used for punishment beyond standard confinement. Perhaps it was here that prisoners were subjected to the silence mask or other forms of torture that have gone unrecorded. Others suggest that the cell might have been the site of an unreported murder or suicide, a death deliberately concealed by prison authorities. What truly sets Cell 17 apart from other haunted locations is the physical nature of its paranormal activity. This is not a place of mere cold spots or unexplained noises. The entity in Cell 17 attacks. The most frequently reported phenomenon is scratching. Visitors emerge from the cell to discover fresh scratch marks on their arms, backs, or necks. Thin, red lines that burn as though recently inflicted. These marks often appear in sets of 3 or 4, suggesting fingers or claws. More disturbing still, some visitors have reported finding bite marks on their bodies, perfect half-moons of teeth impressions that sometimes break the skin. The physical assaults follow a pattern that suggests deliberate malice rather than random paranormal energy. Women are targeted more frequently than men. Skeptics and those who express disbelief in the cell's haunted status often report the most aggressive encounters. Paranormal investigators who bring equipment into the cell frequently find their devices malfunctioning or their batteries inexplicably drained. In 2003, during a paranormal investigation, a researcher's camera captured a series of photographs showing a dark mass forming in the corner of the cell. As the sequence progressed, the mass appeared to take on a vaguely humanoid shape before dissipating. Minutes after these photos were taken, the researcher discovered 3 parallel scratches across his shoulder blade, deep enough to draw blood. Museum staff report that physical items left in cell 17 are often found moved or damaged. Informational placards are repeatedly torn from the wall. Small objects left as experiments, coins, pencils, paper, are found scattered or, in some cases, stacked in unnatural formations. One morning, a tour guide discovered a visitor logbook that had been left in the cell torn to shreds, the pages scattered around the room like confetti. Perhaps most chilling are the auditory phenomena associated with cell 17. After hours, security guards report hearing whispers emanating from the empty cell, not in English, but in what linguists who have analysed recordings suggest might be a dialect of Gaelic or possibly an Aboriginal language. These whispers never resolve into understandable speech, but carry unmistakable tones of anger and threat. During quiet periods, staff and visitors have reported hearing rhythmic tapping from inside the cell walls, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones, repeated in an endless loop. Some speculate this might be a coded message, perhaps using the prisoner's tap code that allowed inmates to communicate between cells. If so, the message has yet to be deciphered. What could explain such aggressive paranormal activity? Parapsychologists offer several theories. The most straightforward explanation is that the cell houses the spirit of a prisoner who died there in a state of extreme emotional distress, perhaps a victim of suicide or murder. The physical attacks could represent a reenactment of the violence that ended their life or express the rage they feel at their fate. Another theory suggests that cell 17 may be what paranormal researchers call a fear cage, a location where the particular mineral composition of the walls and the electromagnetic fields created by the building's electrical systems combine to amplify psychic energy. The bluestone used to construct Old Melbourne Gaol has a high iron content, which some believe can store and release emotional energy like a battery. Skeptics offer more mundane explanations. The scratches reported by visitors, they suggest, could be self-inflicted through subconscious scratching triggered by the power of suggestion. The bite marks could be the result of pressure or friction from clothing, misinterpreted in the heightened emotional state induced by the cell's reputation. The psychological impact of the cell's dimensions should not be underestimated. The narrow space, with its high ceiling and minimal light, creates a natural sensory deprivation chamber. In such environments, the human brain becomes hyperactive, potentially creating hallucinations to fill the sensory void. Yet these rational explanations struggle to account for the consistency of the experiences across decades and the specificity of the physical marks. They also fail to explain why cell 17, identical in construction to dozens of other cells in the jail, would be the exclusive site of such phenomena. Today, Old Melbourne Gaol operates as a museum, offering visitors a glimpse into Australia's penal history. Death masks of executed prisoners line the walls. The gallows stand restored, a grim reminder of the final moments of 133 lives. And Cell 17 remains accessible to the public despite, or perhaps because of, its infamous reputation. The museum conducts regular ghost tours at night, allowing brave visitors to experience the jail when darkness amplifies its oppressive atmosphere. These tours always include a stop at Cell 17, though guides warn participants about the potential for physical encounters with the unseen resident. Paranormal investigation teams regularly conduct overnight sessions in the jail, with Cell 17 being the most requested location. Equipment including thermal cameras, EMF detectors, and audio recorders have captured compelling evidence of anomalous activity, though nothing has definitively identified the entity that calls the cell home. Despite its dark reputation, or perhaps because of it, Cell 17 has become something of a challenge for paranormal enthusiasts. Some visitors deliberately provoke the entity, issuing challenges or insults in hopes of triggering a response. Museum staff discourage this behavior, not only out of respect for whatever might reside in the cell, but also for the safety of the provocateurs. For while many ghost stories are just that, stories, the physical marks left by Cell 17's resident are documented fact. Something in that small bluestone room reaches out to touch the living, and its touch is not gentle. Whatever emotion drives the entity in Cell 17, it is not peace, not sorrow, not loneliness, but something darker. A rage that a century of time has not diminished. As we leave old Melbourne jail behind, we're left with questions that may never find answers. Who is the entity in Cell 17? What crime, either committed by them or against them, has left them forever bound to those bluestone walls? And what would it take to release them from their eternal imprisonment? Perhaps some secrets are meant to remain locked away, just as the prisoners of old Melbourne jail once were. But, unlike those inmates, the presence in Cell 17 seems to have found a way to reach beyond its confinement, to leave its mark on the world of the living. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of Australia's most actively haunted locations, be sure to follow the Haunted Lore podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Each week, we unlock the doors to history's most haunted places and share the stories that conventional historians often overlook. Until then, remember, history is written by the living, but sometimes the dead have their own stories to tell. This has been the Haunted Lore podcast. Sleep well, if you can.